It's a three-day state visit that's also a chance to gauge superpower status. Emmanuel Macron heads to Washington at a time when Europeans are wondering aloud if Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine hasn't made the EU even more dependent on the United States. Arming the Ukrainians has shown just how much NATO relies on its top contributor. Europe's scramble to substitute Russian oil and gas means turning to places like the U.S. for imports of liquefied natural gas. Then there's the long term. With Joe Biden's $369 billion climate bill, known as the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. government's going all in on energy transition with a blueprint for subsidizing green industry that's made in the USA. For now, the EU's plan remains mostly a wish list. Can Macron carve out exceptions for European companies who want in on the action stateside? Is it instead up to European governments to subsidize their own switch to green energy or to take on the Americans? More broadly, how much have transatlantic relations changed since the French president's first White House state dinner? These images from back in 2017. And how much of that change has happened, you could say, just in the last 9 months? Today in the France 24 debate, Emmanuel Macron goes to Washington, and joining us from Brussels, Sandro Gozzi, member of the European Parliament from Emmanuel Macron's centrist Renaissance Bloc. Thanks for being with us. From New York City, John Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. We're also in the company of Franco-American business consultant and commentator Megan Jones.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. And we welcome back Philippe Charles, energy analyst at the Sapiens Institute.
Good evening.
How are things?
I'm fine.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. Emmanuel Macron's Tuesday started in Paris with an early morning welcome to the French presidential palace of the head of state of oil and gas-rich Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Definitely a leader worth courting after his inauguration for a second term last week, particularly as he's distanced himself from Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now, history doesn't tell us if on his way to the airport, Macron saw a rally by meat butchers outside the National Assembly. They're among a long list of trades that need help with their energy bills. The French president flying off to U.S. shores where wholesale gas prices are 5 to 7 times lower than they are here in Europe, Philippe Charles. And this is the issue, isn't it?
Yes, this is really the issue. First of all, if I commend the visit of the visit of the president of Kazakhstan in France, I would say that Kazakhstan is a fantastic country because Kazakhstan has all the elements of the Mendeleev table in its subsurface. Of course, there is oil, gas, but the problem is that there is no access of oil and gas from Kazakhstan to Europe. So there is no possibility for Europe to import oil and gas. But don't forget that Kazakhstan is also the first producer in the world of uranium. So it means that, for instance, the nuclear energy is extremely impacted by the production of uranium in Kazakhstan, and France is for a long time present in Kazakhstan via the ex-company Areva. About the United States, let's say that, of course, France has increased, and also Europe, its importation of natural liquefied gas from United States. Yeah, but I saw the number, and in fact, it's in the range of 10 billion cubic meter per year, which means that finally it's a small part compared to what was previously imported from Russia. So I think I already told you that I don't think that the importation of gas from United States could solve the gas problem in Europe, which remain absolutely crucial.
Yeah, although, we could call up the chart on this. European imports of U.S. Liquefied natural gas have soared. They're still, as you said, minimal to what Russia was providing, but now they make up half of Europe's LNG imports. above Qatar, above Russia. And again, and I'll put it to Sandro Gozzi, who we welcome to our discussion, is there this feeling that Europe has become more dependent on the U.S. since Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, in this period, certainly, we have increased our dependence also on the U.S., like on Norway. I mean, the liquefied natural gas import from the U.S. to Europe have increased sharply from the 28% to the 45%. The problem that, I mean, the American companies are making huge profit by this. And in a case like the Ukrainian case we are talking about, I don't think that it can be an issue that we can only leave to the market. I mean, I was in Washington 10 days ago, ahead of the President Macron visit, and I really didn't find any sensitivity from our American friends on the fact that, I mean, this sharp increase of the energy prices, of the gas prices, is an issue of concern. It's an issue that should be tackled in a cooperative way between EU and US, as we are saying also to Norway. And I think that this could be a point on which President Macron could insist in his visit, in his official visit, state visit to President Biden to Washington.
Did you hear that, John Rick MacArthur, that dig by Sandro Gozzi at windfall profits? We've had a lot of criticism of French energy giant Total for its windfall profits. How about where you are?
Well, Americans don't care that much about Europe. That's a sad fact. If they did, they'd be paying more attention to the non-negotiations about Ukraine. But windfall profits, that's what we do for a living here. I mean, the oil companies always benefit from crises, and they've done very well during this crisis. So he's quite right to point it out. And but big oil has an immense amount of lobbying power in this country. So does big coal, as it turns out. And the fossil fuel business, notwithstanding the Inflation Reduction Act, which is supposed to be a great green act, they still call the tune. They still dominate the energy policy. So we're not going to be offering discounts to the Europeans or forcing the oil companies or the liquid natural gas exporters to reduce their prices.
And probably Emmanuel Macron's not expecting that. Just a reminder, by the way, the French president is not president of Europe, only of America's oldest ally, an alliance that still needs a bit of mending when the state visit was first announced last year, as Yinka Oyetade reports.
Just a year ago, relations between the US and France were at a low point. A very public spat between the two countries cost Paris a valuable submarine deal with Australia. And in the fallout, President Emmanuel Macron recalled the French ambassador to the US for consultation. Now, as Macron heads to Washington on a state visit, the two countries are keen to show they've put all their issues behind them. The meeting is set to be the first state visit of Joe Biden's presidency, and Washington has left the world under no illusions as to why it chose France for the occasion.
I mean, if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, look at what's going on in the Indo-Pacific and the tensions with China, France is really at the center of all those things. And President Macron has been a dynamic leader inside the G7, particularly there in Europe. And so the president felt that this was exactly the right and the most appropriate country to start with for state visits.
Along with those issues, the US's newly passed Inflation Reduction Act, which has been a sticking point between the two countries, is also set to be on the agenda for talks. The legislation provides tax credits to consumers who buy green technology made in the US, including electric vehicles. Brussels has argued these subsidies amount to unfair protectionism, while France says the law threatens to put European manufacturers at a competitive disadvantage.
As if the twin transition and the energy crisis was not challenging enough, we now have to deal of some of the negative impact of the US Inflation Reduction Act. Behind these measures imposed by the US lies a much more important risk, I believe, which is a complete change in investment flow.
Despite Europe's concerns, the White House argues the legislation goes a long way in helping the US meet global efforts to curb climate change.
Yeah, a change in investment flows. You heard Thierry Breton saying there, Megan Jones. In other words, the fear that if European companies want to continue to do business over there, they're going to have to relocate to the U.S. This is a far cry from what Democrats were hailing as progressive legislature when it was passed over the summer, that this was a move to make the world's top polluter go green, and it was being hailed.
Well, there's this idea of green jobs in the U.S. for a long time, that all we need to do is have this Green New Deal, and then magically the great American job maker, the job factory will come back, and somehow the union movement will come back as well, and we'll have the wind in the sails for an American economy that's more equitable, more green, you know, all these kind of good things. I think it's fair to say that the Anti-Inflation Act will go someplace towards that goal for the average American citizen, but it's probably not going to address all those different structural issues. So in terms of the Washington policymakers, if they're seeing this today, I would say that you also have to weigh in what impact it's going to have on our European allies in the long term. So basically, I would say that, yes, indeed, the European businesses will take a big hit from this. And is this act really going to save the average American from decades of less and less power of unions, decades of reduced buying power? No, it's not. So I think that the short and the long-term goals need to be weighed against each other, and the structural issues still need to be addressed in a bigger way. What was really interesting for the American public in the act is that it gave the Medicare and the U.S. public authorities the ability to negotiate drug prices with the pharmaceutical companies. So that might begin to have an effect on the average American consumer. But in terms of what it means for our European allies, who are sometimes also those pharmaceutical companies, Sanofi, Aventis, et cetera, it's yet to be seen. So I think that it's very fair, the criticisms that the French and European governments are having of this law and the likely effects on the European green energy producers.
All right, so fair criticism, you're saying. The conservative broadsheet newspaper Le Figaro goes further. A Trumpist with a human face is how one French analyst depicts Joe Biden in that newspaper. That's because Europeans are worried about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really $369 billion for its climate plan. Here are just some of the measures in there. Tax credits for clean energy, tax credits for U.S. manufacturing for solar, wind, batteries, etc., and tax credits for electric vehicles produced in North America, Sandro Gozzi. In North America means U.S., Canada, Mexico. Can Emmanuel Macron come back from Washington with a carve-out to that deal that lets Europeans also get in on that?
Well, I think we should. I think we should, because it is clear that here we are talking about a huge amount of subsidies, direct or indirect, as you mentioned, the tax credit, for companies which make their products in the USA, and this has a delocalization effect also from the European market to the US market. Then we cannot accept. We shouldn't be naive. I mean, on one side, I'm very glad that our American friend commit themselves very strongly with a huge budget to go toward the green transition. On the other hand, and this cannot be done at our expenses, so I think that we should also use our size, our power. After all, we are the first market in the world. We are talking about a market of 500 million consumers, and we should develop a sort of buy European act, as Macron as announced a month ago, and I think that also we should see this occasion while avoiding, because we are in an emergency situation. So I mean, I don't think that this is it is a long-term feature of our relationship. But in this crisis situation, especially because of Ukraine, we have to seize this opportunity or this problem to develop a truly European industrial policy and to put flesh on the bones.
So you're advocating, Sandro Gozzi,
of European strategic autonomy. I'm advocating to do something similar in Europe, because I don't see why. Yes, but I don't see why we should wait and see while our companies are going across the Atlantic to produce in the European market and in the American market. Yes, I think that we should go toward a sort of Buy European Act to support our industry in this very delicate moment for Europe and for the world.
Philippe Charles, you agree?
Yeah, but I think that behind the Inflation Reduction Act, so effectively you gave the number, it was $370 billion or $60 billion.
69, let's not quit.
69, so 70 for clean energies, reducing with an objective of reducing the CO2 emission of 50% in 2030. But what is surprising and show the real politic of Joe Biden, it's that he signed 3 days ago the construction for a terminal of oil export in the Gulf of Mexico for 2 million barrels of oil per day. So which shows that in fact behind the act, he think that there is also, he see Europe also as an oil market, according to the fact that we will import much less oil from Russia.
But we got a report this week
and
that
so,
we're still importing a lot of liquefied natural gas even from Russia.
Liquefied natural gas, but here it's not liquefied natural gas, it's a terminal which should start to be constructed in 2025 to export oil and very probably to Europe. So he see in the future Europe as a possibility to export shale oil and not anymore shale gas to Europe from United States. So I would say that don't believe that behind the Inflation Reduction Act there is only a green thing. There is also behind that, as the correspondent from New York said, that oil and gas still represent 82% of the world energy mix, and so he knows that Europe will continue to consume oil in the next 10 and even to 20 years, and so you don't build and you don't invest in such an oil export terminal for 2 or 3 years. So it means that he has also a long-term view on exporting oil to Europe.
John Rick MacArthur, it's about business deals, but it's also about national security, or at least Europe's security. There's a war on this continent. And the Europeans realized that too late that they were over-dependent on Russian oil and gas. What do they do?
Well, I'm glad we're getting to Ukraine, because I guess we all agree that the Americans are quite cynical and they're engaged in realpolitik, and that the supposed green aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act are counterbalanced by increased oil production and increased coal production in West Virginia, because a big part of this deal was to satisfy Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, which makes me wonder why President Macron isn't using this trip to try to settle the war in Ukraine, because ultimately that's what's going to make Europe more independent generally, and less dependent on American energy exports, is if there's a settlement in the war in Ukraine. People seem to have forgotten.
What kind of a settlement are you talking about?
Right now, the official position of both countries is there can't be any negotiations without the permission of the Ukrainians, which is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, this is a global or a huge, almost global conflict now, which has repercussions everywhere in Europe and also to some extent in the United States. And to say that France, which is the only other continental nuclear power in Europe besides Russia, has its hands tied, has to tie its hands to the American policy on NATO expansion or NATO integrity or whatever, or American conceptions of national security, is counterproductive. It's self-destructive. So if I were Macron, I would be using this occasion to either to declare a certain amount of negotiating independence from the United States vis-a-vis Russia, and to get out of this this loop, which says we can't do anything unless the Ukrainians say it's okay, because this is a war.
But hang on,
this is a war that's going to have to be settled by the Americans.
John McMacArthur, try telling that to the Baltic states that also border Russia.
Well, but here's the point.
They're NATO members too, and there is this sense that Vladimir Putin will not stop at Ukraine. At what point does, again, defense become more important than making money?
But this again brings up the question of the possibility of French negotiating leverage. The Russians now have nuclear weapons, medium-range nuclear missiles in Kaliningrad, on the border, virtually on the border of Poland. You know, you'd have 30 seconds to respond to a Russian nuclear attack from those bases. That's a European problem. That's a European issue. That's a French issue, which could be negotiated along with Ukrainian territorial integrity and what the borders are and so on and so forth. But there doesn't seem to be any impetus in the French delegation to bring up these issues. Does anybody talk about those nuclear missiles, the Russian nuclear missiles in that enclave there? No. Does anybody talk about the French as a nuclear power? No, I don't hear anybody discussing.
But we have heard the French president talking about strategic autonomy, and I'll put it to you, Megan Jones, because there's a NATO foreign ministers meeting taking place in Bucharest, and they're realizing that for firepower, Europe is very dependent on the United States. Still today, the Caesar rockets that the French have, they've given a quarter of them already for the war in Ukraine. It's not just, it's also conventional weapons where Europe finds itself overstretched and realizes it's over-dependent. They've even said so on the United States.
I think it's fair to say they are indeed over-dependent, and I think there's almost nothing I can think of that would illustrate that more. Is that, you know, in the U.S. there's this movement of so much solidarity with Ukraine that people on the street who have access to all kinds of assault weapons and everything, because it's the U.S., they're actually raising money to send, you know, munitions that they buy at Walmart over to Ukraine, and their own, you know, gear from their former, their former military and paramilitary activities. So I think that says a lot in itself right there, the level of dependence on American defense. And as far as what should France do about it, I think there's a lot of questions around that, not just France, but Europe. But it's really interesting because in our discussion, the more we speak about France as a nuclear power, the more we speak about the role that France should have in negotiating this Ukraine war, it raises a bigger question over who's the leader of Europe. Who do we even go to? And that'll be really interesting in terms of American and European relations, and what role is France going to play in Europe industrial policy.
So several questions in what you just said. Let's turn to Sandro Gozzi and get him to answer a few of them in succession. First of all, let's start with that last one. Is Emmanuel Macron in Washington as the leader of Europe?
Well, de facto, Emmanuel Macron is the leader of Europe because it's the only one who has managed to impose a vision at the European level, and also because there is an ambiguity in the European international stance of France's main partner in Germany, and there is, and Emmanuel Macron has also, and there is a change. There has been a change in government in Rome. We have shifted from Mario Draghi to Giorgia Meloni. So it is clear that today the main interlocutor, strategic interlocutor for his vision, for his action, also seen from Washington, is Emmanuel Macron. That is also the sense of this state visit which Emmanuel Macron is paying to President Biden in Washington without any doubt.
Yeah, and we saw the lead editorial this Tuesday in the Financial Times urging Macron to speak up for Europe. And in it, Philippe Charles, this is the Financial Times asking Macron to argue Europe's case when he goes to Washington.
Yes, but I think that I don't know if every country agree on the fact that Macron represents Europe. He was previously, I think, until last June, the representative because France was leading.
France had the rotating presidency of the European Council.
Rotating president, and so he was representing Europe. But is he today representing Europe? I think if you ask, for instance, Mr. Orban, I don't think that Mr. Orban recognized today that Mr. Macron recognized Europe. I think, Mr. Deputy, you are in the same group as Mr. Macron, so you recognize him as representing you, but is he representing all the group of the European Parliament?
Facto,
I am not so sure. But I am not here to make politics.
Listen,
so.
But beyond the formalities you are talking about, Professor, beyond the formalities, there is a political reality. The political reality today that the only active and recognized leader in Europe is Emmanuel Macron. And the political reality and the pragmatism is as a citizenship in Washington. And I can tell you that seen from Washington today, there is one main interlocutor in Europe, which is Emmanuel Macron, beyond the formality, beyond the fact that I belong to Europe, and beyond the end of the French presidency, for the reason that has been mentioned. Because Emmanuel Macron, today, the position between Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron is very similar also in Ukraine. The fact that Emmanuel Macron has strongly supported Ukraine, but always has tried to keep an open diplomatic channel with Putin. Today, it is appreciated in Washington. France is the only nuclear power in the European Union. France is the only member of the Security Council in the European Union. France is at the forefront also of the need to build up a European defense. All these are the things that are interesting in Washington, not the fact that Orban and Macron disagree. Because I tell you, one thing is the institutional structure of the Union, and the other thing is the political reality. And I regret the fact that we don't have such an active Germany as we could hope, looking at the coalition.
Well, we heard on that score, Sandro Gozzi, we heard Olaf Scholz just a short while ago stating that, quote, fighting climate change should not mean putting up trade barriers. Is he starting to find his pace after a year in power?
I hope so. I hope so, because we need a very strong European Germany to reform the Union and to fully play the role that we as Europeans we should play. I hope that Scholz will find his way. I think that it was a mistake of Olaf Scholz to organize this visit to China at the moment without giving to this visit a strong European feeling like Emmanuel Macron did when he received the Chinese president at the Élysée, together with Angela Merkel at the time, together with the president of the European Commission. And I think that this is a lost occasion, but the more Olaf Scholz finds its European path, the better, not only for Germany, but for the Europe as a whole, of course.
John Rick McCarthy, you agree?
Do I agree that I'm not clear on what I'm agreeing with?
Do you agree that Europe needs that Franco-German motor speaking with one voice right now?
Well, I would be happy if Macron would represent France, not just the European Union. Again, France has a distinguished history of independent, non-aligned negotiating status. It goes back to de Gaulle and so on, and the disputes over whether to be in or out of NATO. And the Germans, I think, would be relieved if the French would take the lead on some kind of peace initiative in the Ukrainian conflict. You know, you hear very few practical solutions to Ukraine. No one discusses them. But one thing that I've brought up here is the presence of the Russian nuclear missiles in Kaliningrad. That could be part of a global peace settlement over Ukraine. The Russians have to take their missiles out of Kaliningrad in exchange for NATO renouncing any ambition to bring Ukraine into it. This is an idea I've heard from a defense military writer named Jean-Philippe Marijon, who writes interesting things on this. But why Macron doesn't dare to take the lead is a question that the French have to ask, not the European Parliament.
Let me get Sandro Gozzi in on that. Your reaction, what you're hearing from John Rick MacArthur.
But first of all, I mean, the European Parliament playing its role, and I'm here as a member of the European Parliament. So, I mean, of course, I talk as a member of the European Parliament and not as a member of the Élysée. At the Élysée, there is a President Macron. So, I mean, I don't see why the European Parliament should have a say on this. Also because we put a lot of money to help economically, macroeconomically, and also to give arms to Ukraine. So I think that our American interlocutor should know that also the European Parliament plays a role. I don't see Macron as not playing this role. On the contrary, Macron has always been at the forefront of all the phases of this crisis since the 24th of February, and of course is coming to Washington as a president of the French Republic with also, I believe, very clear ideas on what to do in Europe, not only today, but how we see the new European continent. The initiative that Emmanuel Macron took, for example, on the European political community, which must prepare a new cooperation and security architecture in Europe, one that the talks will have started between Ukraine and Russia is another indication that is not only committed today during the crisis, during the war, but is also preparing Europe to be able to rethink the way it cooperates and rethink its security architecture. And I'm convinced that also on this, and not only on the position on Zelensky and Putin, also on this, compare also to a few months ago, today there is a stronger convergence between Biden and Macron, and I am convinced that this will be an issue that President Macron will discuss with Biden in Washington.
Yeah, the difference between the U.S. and France, the U.S. and Europe over over trade now and the energy transition. It's something that Macron's hosts say won't spoil the official dinner. Au contraire, they're all ears.
We're absolutely willing to have that conversation and to find a way to work through those issues of concern. But it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, clean energy, that's a tide that raises all boats. The more we can transition to a clean energy economy around the world, and there's plenty of opportunity for everybody in that.
It's not a zero-sum game, Philippe Charles?
No, I don't think so. We need cooperation.
This energy transition is going so fast.
It's going so fast. People would like it goes fast, but I don't know if it's going so fast. When you look at the emission today and when you look at the emission 10 years ago, they increased by around 10% in the world, decreasing a little bit in the OECD countries, but in the world they have increased. I'm sorry. So going so fast, I'm not so convinced. I think that Europe has also an opportunity to build itself its energy transition. We didn't speak about the European Union Sovereignty Act, which is effectively something that Europe would like to bring some industry related to energy transition in Europe. I speak, of course, about batteries, hydrogen, semiconductors, even raw material. I think that behind that, because there are in Europe some European wants to import to some type of industry, but there are behind that big societal problems. And I asked to Mr. the Deputy if do you think really that Europe is ready, for instance, to reopen mines, to extract rare metals, to build batteries?
Well, we're seeing the case here in France with the announcement of the opening of a lithium mine in the center of the country.
And so there is already big oppositions. If Europe wants to build itself its energy transition, it has to accept also, for instance, to reopen mines, to extract rare metals like lithium, for instance, to build batteries. For that, we need a lot of pedagogy to people, because people have been used not to see any more mines around them. Are they ready to reopen mines? Not so sure.
Sandro Gozzi?
Well, I mean, this is what is happening. Of course, on one side, there are big discussion for one very important reason, that we have to tackle the emergency now, but we don't have to renounce on our medium and long-term objective, strategic objective, as a society, as industry, as a market, which is the green transition, the Green Deal, and to be the first continent in the world to get to reach the target of zero CO2 emission. This is, I mean, Europe without carbon emission is our main goal. It is clear that the Ukrainian crisis pushed us to slightly change in the short run this strategy. There are mines who are still used. There are programs which has been revised. There is even, the issue of the existing power station in Germany, which will be used longer than foreseen. So we are discussing, and the different governments, they are discussing on how to tackle the energy crisis in the very short run. But the discussion to which our interlocutor was referring to is the fact that we don't want to shift away from our long-term strategy, because we think that that is in the strategic interest, industrial interest of our continent.
Yeah, we've just had the reopening of a coal mine here in the northeastern France. But that's, as Sandro Gozzi was saying, was for the immediate term. Megan Jones, do you get what's changed in the last 9 months? And I asked the question again with a view to when Macron and Biden toast each other at that state dinner on Thursday.
Well, I'm glad that you asked me that question, because that opened the field for this one variable that we haven't talked about at all, which is the euro-dollar exchange rate, which has gone crazy over this summer. I mean, I've lived in France, I've earned in euros for a long time, and all of a sudden, those euros were not as useful as they once were. And it's really incredible to see, in the face of all of this geopolitical uncertainty, what this has done to the exchange rates, what that does in turn to the trade deficit. So all of these issues are very much interlinked. And if we bring it back to this Anti-Inflation Act,
if you're complaining about the Fed raising its rates in a sudden fashion, it's also a sign that, well, the dollar is still king and the U.S. is more than ever the world's #1 superpower?
Well, I think that's a really big question. So I'll try to take that one in parts. But first of all, in terms of this desire to raise the inflation rate all of a sudden after years of the interest rate, but just basically the inflation rate. So I don't know if that was a Freudian slip, but it's just incredible. We are beginning to finally see recovery after all of these hits the economy has taken. And it's like, let's now force businesses to operate in an inflationary environment. People like me, we've never even seen inflation in our whole careers. And then now all of a sudden we need to rethink the whole way of doing business because of the context of the higher cost of everything on top of the inflation and the scarcity of resources.
And this gets back to the conversation we had with John Rip MacArthur earlier about defense. Is the resentment to be leveled towards the United States and its Federal Reserve, its central bank, or to Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I think you got to assign each of them what they're capable or not capable of doing. So it's clear that the Ukraine war, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a tendency to, have a smaller tent and do less global business, which is going to overall increase the cost of business, especially after we've seen after the pandemic. People don't want to have these global supply chains to the same extent that they did before. They want to, know that in France we can produce as many masks as we want to. In the US, they want to make sure we are still our own breadbasket. We can still do everything for ourselves. And, this kind of tendency around the world to be isolationist, which has been to perhaps not isolationist, but at least nationalist to some extent. And then in the US, this has just been off the charts since Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, wanting to, concentrate on what's going on within the US. There's been less aggressive or less strategic action regarding the rise of China than there may have been under, other circumstances. And then now we've got this Ukraine war and, so I feel like the US is neither acting like a global superpower and leader. We live more and more in a multipolar world, but it's also very self-focused. And, in terms of this anti-inflation act, it's very much a misnomer while the Fed is increasing the interest rates. So, there's a lot of different factors there. And in terms of, does that mean the dollar is still king? I mean, the dollar is king while the faith in the U.S. government is relatively high. But, there's a lot of stuff going on within the U.S. that I think that we shouldn't have as much faith, perhaps, as we do as a global society. So
we come out of this pandemic, John Rick MacArthur, and of course that's the big difference, right? Besides the fact that you have a different U.S. president from the last time Emmanuel Macron attended a White House state dinner, the other big difference is the war in Ukraine. We mentioned it, but also the pandemic, and we've seen the last days scenes of protest in China that we hadn't seen for years. Are all of the superpowers less powerful? Or is the jury still out?
I don't think they're less powerful, but what I'm imagining would be useful also, besides a discussion about practical solutions to the Ukraine-Russia war, is if Macron and Biden can talk about their mutual political problem, which is the big menace to both of them is on the nationalist right, not from the left, not from nombriliste. I'm sorry, I'm going into franglais here. Self-interested Americans, self-interested French. There is a powerful movement in both countries on the right, the nationalist right. Take care of your own people. Stop with your grandiose international ambitions and so on and so forth. So they could make common cause. They could find something to talk about, which could lead to some kind of practical political solution that would serve both of them, because they both have the same problem. They both have the same Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump are very powerful in France and in the United States. And this is a threat to both Macron and to Biden.
It's a threat to Macron and to Biden, and have the midterm elections shown a recipe for confronting that?
No, it hasn't been. There's been no resolution. I mean, what we have is stasis. The House is now barely Republican. The Senate will be barely Democratic. We have a president who's Democratic but is vulnerable, and you have a big split in the Republican Party between the regular Republicans and the Trumpists. So, the situation is very, very volatile politically here. Very, very volatile, in some ways, very dangerous, and nothing has been resolved. Again, going back to the Inflation Reduction, what do we call it? The Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah. It's partly green pork barrel. Do we all know what pork barrel is?
Well, basically, for carving out favors for your local constituents.
Right, for our French friends. And also a way to save face with the left, the green left, which is to some extent represented by Bernie Sanders, but not entirely, but also to satisfy the needs, the political needs of a certain senator from a coal-producing state, Joe Manchin, West Virginia. You could also call the Inflation Reduction Act the Save West Virginia Coal Act. So
we're almost out of time, so I want to bring in just for one final word, Sandro Gozzi. Pick up on John Rick MacArthur's point. Is there a common cause that Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron can make when it comes to the far right and their right flank?
Yes, I fully agree with this analysis. I had absolutely the same feeling when I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, when I met many members of the Congress of the Democratic Party, and we share the same feeling. First of all, in 2024, in my view, in the US election, the match is open now because, I mean, the not so bad result compared to the forecast expectations of the Democrats indicates clearly that the Democrats can win the election in 2024, but there are clearly common issues in France and the US, in Europe and the US, on how to find the most effective way to fight the extreme right, to fight the nationalists. And from this perspective, I think that concentrating on new solutions, not only on economic growth and social growth, but also on, alliance between democracies, alliance between progressive forces, as, Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron represent, can be a way ahead, and I hope it's going to be one of the issues that the two presidents will discuss, because that's a real, outstanding political issue.
Sandro Gozzi, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank John Rick MacArthur in New York City, Philippe Charles, Megan Jones, our coverage of that state visit on our website, france24.com. Thanks for watching.